I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to also acknowledge the work that First Nations people have put into care for country for tens of thousands of years and highlight the incredible untapped knowledge and resources we have to draw on, and to note that this is experience that we must absolutely draw on for some of the issues that we are discussing today. For those who don't know, we are an independent daily news publication that is 100% owned and run by women. We are a small team of journalists and we write about politics, business, tech, I can say this word, entrepreneurship and women and girls globally. But increasingly, we have been writing more on climate, especially over the past few years. So on that note, I thought I might start with a story, and it is a story that I'm sure everyone in this room has some kind of version of themselves. So the story is New Year's Eve 2019, and I was staying with my in-laws down the south coast. And the entire town had been engulfed in smoke for days, as Sydney had been for weeks at that time as well. So we've got this very vivid memory of the sky turning dark, and we started to obviously turn our attention to the ABC to figure out what's going on, and we could see that towns south and north of us were engulfed by fire. So the situation didn't get worse, thankfully, for that town from there, but we did take in an additional 20 or so people from a few kilometres away who did need to come in and spend the night with us and had to evacuate, and we were able to give them a home at that point. And we had our 3 kids there, and other people brought their kids in, and it was amazing to watch these kids who just all played together, obviously with no idea of what was going on, and our anxiety was just rising in the process. And then my son brought this story up recently, saying, remember that time? It was like New Year's Eve and all these people came over to Nanny and Granddad's house, and it was like, yeah, he remembers that, he can see that. And he's like, the sky turned dark, and he's carried that memory. And he brought up another one last week, and he said, remember that time when we had to walk through the knee-deep water from school, walk home because of that crazy weather that occurred that day? And I was like, yeah, it was about a year ago. But yeah, and again, it's a vision that he carries. And everyone has stories like this, and increasingly our children will have more of such stories. And I mean, ours were kind of mere talking points, but for others, they are stories of deep loss and trauma, and I'm sure people in this room have those stories here. These stories are loads that we carry, and they are loads that so often women carry, thinking especially about what the future will look like for children given what we've just witnessed in the past few years. So I remember driving home on New Year's Day, and we went through kind of just kilometres and kilometres and kilometres of black and burned bush, and I'm sure everyone had seen that. And I talked to our team, so to Tala and to Madeline, everyone sort of had these similar stories of what they'd witnessed over those past few days. And so at that point, we decided that we really wanted to go harder on climate coverage and introduce it as a pillar of what we cover. We decided that actually, maybe we didn't decide, we actually kind of realised that everything we are trying to achieve with what we do with Women's Agenda to try and elevate diversity and wider perspectives across politics and business and leadership and entrepreneurship, and it really does all come back to the massive challenges that we have ahead, including climate change. We realise that every story is a climate change story, and I hope that more media will see it that way too. We realise that any talk on progress for women and girls here and overseas is threatened by climate change. Regardless of how good the cupcakes might look on International Women's Day, and with those pointless break the bias and the equity one that's going around at the moment, all of that. So regardless of all that, regardless of the slight drop in the gender pay gap that we saw over the past week, regardless of how inspiring it is, and it is inspiring to see where women are achieving incredible firsts and breaking through glass ceilings, regardless of all of that, that progress is at risk because of climate change, and we also risk the potential for future progress also. But I feel like these issues seem to get ignored, and I feel like there's been a bit of a turning point, and I think we're seeing that now, and I think that's evidenced by people in the room and also the partners who have joined us on this report as well. But even on IWD last year, when UN Women had a slogan relevant to climate change, really highly relevant, we saw how numerous events chose to ignore that and chose to avoid that conversation and not think about it. So anyway, we have been publishing more on the impacts of climate change on women, and I'm pleased to say that our audience is more interested as well. And as someone who sits back and looks at the data and the stats on who's reading what, I can tell you a few years ago we just we weren't getting the traction there. We kept going at it, we weren't getting the traction in terms of the reading, and now we are. That's regarding the climate change stories, I should say. So we've also seen so much excellent research from organisations like Care Australia, which are here today, on how climate change is already making an impact on women and girls globally, on things like the rates of child marriage, on education, on gender-based violence, and so much more. And we are seeing more research here in Australia highlighting the added impact of natural disasters on women. The uptick in domestic and family violence that followed the 2009 Victorian bushfires, the uptick in calls to Queensland Police regarding domestic violence that followed the Queensland floods of 2012, and the surge again that followed the 2019 and 2020 bushfires, and the anecdotal evidence from Lismore as well that we're yet to see the more concrete evidence on, which we sadly will in the coming months. We saw the disruption to reproductive services, like during the Lismore floods, where health workers were sandbagging the facility instead of being able to provide the essential service. And then there is the added burden on so much and things that many of us may not even think about or realise. And we had this conversation on Tuesday at another event where looking at migrant refugee women facing cultural and sometimes language barriers in being able to leave the home during heat waves and extreme weather, especially in Western Sydney, and to get to, say, a cool shopping mall or to get to a fast food outlet, which I recently saw research on, becomes a really common place where people go during that cooler weather. But it's not so easy for people to get to. It's not easy for people with disability to get to. It's not easy for people who have caring responsibilities to get to. And if you don't have air conditioning at home, obviously this is a real issue and we need to make sure that people are seeing it that way. So we really wanted to pull as much as we could from all of these different things together for the report that we are launching today called The Climate Load. And it's the idea being that we can take part of this conversation into the conversations that are occurring next week around International Women's Day, and to really put this high on the agenda of anyone who's running an event or talking about these things. So we've called it The Climate Load, and we will also be publishing various stories from this report over the coming few weeks as well, to try and give them their own, make sure that they're emphasised, make sure we can reach as many readers as possible. And why the climate load? Well, you likely know about the mental load. So that's referring to the worry and the concern and thinking about that, and the additional thinking that so many women take on, particularly around their unpaid work and caring responsibilities. The climate load comes in addition to the paid work load and the care load and the mental load, and it refers to the added unpaid work women are and will do around climate change. The cleanup, the coordination, the representation and trying to get heard and trying to make these issues heard, plus the added load on health and safety, and the added mental health issues and worry that women carry. So I want to just share a few stats from the report, and I promise I won't go on too much longer, but we might just go to, this is the first slide. So the first slide from our own polling. So we looked at the invisible workload at home, and so we did a poll of Women's Agenda readers just over the past month and had around 600 responses. We just wanted to try and get a feel for what people were thinking around this topic as well, and asked various questions like this. So the first one being that we saw this is an extra piece of the load as well, that around a quarter are saying that they are solely responsible for reducing emissions at home, and while 38% say that they take the lead on the household on this. 64% said their mental health has been impacted, almost half said their financial security has been impacted, and 3/4 said they've been personally impacted by extreme weather events. On to the next slide. A few things from past disasters that we've seen. I put there the first one around COVID because I think that's important to this experience as well. So it shows that this is from New South Wales, an additional 60,000 women experienced abuse for the first time in the first year of the pandemic. So that was in New South Wales alone. And that really speaks to the added, the stress that occurs in that tinderbox environment in the home around the difficulties that were going on during that period. And we wanted to highlight that because, obviously that's relevant to other disasters too. That women living in the worst bushfire-affected communities following the Victorian Black Saturday fires experienced violence at 7 times the rate of those in moderately or minimally affected areas. Also, we just put there a line about the silencing which came out of that 2012 research as well. This talk about the silencing that can occur following a disaster because the media attention is on it and they want to see heroes and rebuilding and people coming together and being able to support each other in the community. And what the research found was, well, actually, it's really hard if you are in an abusive situation to speak up about it, to seek the help that you want, because it feels like you're complaining or that you are not acknowledging the stress that your abusive partner might be under. So that's a really important point here as well, that silencing that can occur for long after the disaster hits and impacting women who are at risk and experiencing violence. We also looked at female-dominated sectors, and I can say there's not a huge amount on this, and there really does need to be a lot more in terms of how these sectors are being impacted by climate change. We and Tyler was able to collect some anecdotal research from Lismore, looking at some of the, or from the Northern Rivers rather, where she's from, but looking at some of the centres there that did experience flooding or even minimal flooding, but what happened to those educators there, where they then took on the added load of dealing with the trauma of the children who were coming in and the families who were coming in. One centre spoke about the fact that all of a sudden they got inundated with all these kids from another centre. If anyone's ever put your kid in a new childcare centre, you probably know about how difficult it is on the educators during those days. And so they had all these new kids suddenly starting. Some of them had lost their homes, and they spoke about the kids are crying when it rains. Still so traumatised from it. Sorry. Sorry, that one got me. Sorry, Tyler. This was from Tyler's conversations, but as I was reading that through the report, that quote really just got me. Because these people don't have the resources, it sounded like, they don't have the resources available. They don't have the mental health support to know what to do with these kids. They're like, we're not trained to deal with this, and we'll share more on that shortly. I'm sure Tyler can speak better to that because I clearly can't get a sentence out on it. So, okay, let's talk about the bright spots. So the bright spots that we really want to highlight was, obviously there's opposition, and obviously there's plenty of opposition in it, but obviously there's opportunity in the green transition ahead, and that is opportunity that we want to highlight now, opportunity for more women in these roles. We want to make sure that renewable energy doesn't kind of go the way of STEM, where we're trying to work backwards, trying to make sure that girls and women are inspired to work in these sectors and are inspired to make sure, well, rather, are not hitting barriers that mean that they leave these sectors as well. So a few things. I love, despite not being able to say the word entrepreneur, I love writing about startups and entrepreneurship, and I would love this stat that 40% of climate tech startups have a female founder. I think that's just really powerful because that is not translating across fintech startups. It's not across other startups where it's actually pretty dire, the lack of funding that is going to all female-founded businesses and to even to businesses with a female co-founder. The second one there, that 39% of the 39% of the clean energy workforce is female, according to the Clean Energy Council, and also that recently that when global leaders signed a pledge for equal pay, leadership and opportunity for women in the clean energy sector in 2030. I mean, we just saw that at least we're having the conversation, at least we're talking about the need to get more women into these sectors in Australia, but also overseas as well. They were the stats that I wanted to share, so I think it's time for me to go, and I hope that we can support more discussions around climate change and the impact on gender equality. I firmly believe that there is no progress on gender. I firmly believe that we can't have a conversation about gender equality without bringing climate change in the same way that I think that every story really is a climate story given our current situation. This report is made possible thanks to our supporters. So a special thanks to Care Australia, who know all too well the need to see the conversation carry further across to women and girls in the Pacific and elsewhere. And they've helped us in bringing in some case studies from women in the Pacific into the report, which is really nice to see because obviously we want to elevate that and highlight our responsibility there as well. Also, thank you to Charles Sturt University, who's really been a long-term supporter of women's agenda and also just knows the value and contributions of women's work all too well. And to AGL, who really want to work with us in raising awareness of these critical issues and particularly the role of women in the transition ahead. I'll now introduce my co-founder, Tyler Lambert, who will come up to introduce our panel. And so please do keep eating if you haven't finished already. And thank you so much.